everybody. Oh man, I get a chair. This is interesting. Comfortable. I thought I was going to be standing up. This is comfortable. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Lamont Hill. I am the owner of Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books. And I am very happy, very excited, very honored to be here with you for our 7th Martin Luther King Day Radical Symposium. You know, every year we have brought together different speakers, different thinkers, different organizers, different activists to help us reflect on the legacy of King, and I'm always honored to be a part of it. This year y'all stuck with me by myself, so I hope I don't disappoint you too much. But I wanted to use this moment, this opportunity to help us think about Martin Luther King Jr. and his life and his legacy. The reason why Uncle Bobby's started the Radical Symposium, and we do one for Bell Hooks, we do one for Malcolm X. The reason why we do it is because of the country we live in, the society that we live in. We live in a society that loves to remember things. There's money in remembering things. There's money in award shows and commemorative placemats and special days and special months. There's an investment in remembering and celebration and self-congratulation and doing all of these things. America loves to remember. You go to the history section of a bookstore. You watch the old Wild Wild West cowboy movies. You watch, how many films have we made on Lincoln? How many autobiographies and biographies rather are there on Lincoln? We love to remember things. But what's equally fascinating in America is what someone named Andres was saying, referred to as the time paradox. This idea that in America, at the same time that we love to remember stuff, we are simultaneously obsessed with forgetting. We want to remember the past, but we want to remember the past in very particular ways. We want to acknowledge that America creates a more perfect union, but they don't want to acknowledge the starting place from which we had to get more perfect. They want to remember founding fathers, a patriarchal idea in and of itself. But they don't want to remember the legacy of slavery that emerges, out of which this emerges rather. 10 of the first 12 US presidents were slaveholders. Enslaved Africans were traded literally out of the White House, but that doesn't make it into our memory. And now, my God, it's not a subtle erasure. It's not a subtle commitment to forgetting. We are literally taking textbooks out of schools. We are literally changing curriculum. We won't say slavery, one proposal said. We'll talk about it as a voluntary or involuntary work program. I wish I could say that I was making a joke. But this is literally how we navigate this crazy, crazy world. And so when it comes to our heroes, when it comes to our legacies, when it comes to our traditions, when it comes to our struggles, we are either encouraged to forget them altogether, and it's only us that resurrects them. We resurrected Baldwin. Baldwin wasn't getting quoted. He wasn't on the back of everybody's tote bag. He wasn't on everybody's t-shirt. His face wasn't plastered all around the world 25 years ago. But we did the work of resurrecting Baldwin because we need Baldwin for this time. We need Baldwin for this moment. When we were on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, when we were on the streets of Minneapolis, Minnesota, when we were on the streets of Sanford, Florida, and we started to hear Assata Shakur's name, and we started to see Assata Shakur's face, and we started to quote Assata Shakur, It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. We needed that narrative. We needed to reimagine the world on terms that were in line with our tradition. So we had to retrieve people from the dustbins of history. But then also, sometimes they let you remember the person, but they force you to remember them differently than they were. And when it comes to the great Martin Luther King Jr., that's exactly what we've done. You walk through an American street, you walk into an American church, black, white, don't matter. You go to an American high school, you go to Germantown High School, Albany High School, you go to Central High School. They still open. I think so. And you hear King's name, King's story, King legacy. You watch TV. They used to have them Paul Winfield movies. I don't know if y'all remember them. Martin Luther King. You can't find a person that don't love Martin Luther King. You go to the Democrat, Republican, Socialist, Green Party, Communist Party, Independent Party, don't matter. Every political party claims Dr. King. They all loved him. You would think Dr. King died of natural causes. And in the process of embracing King posthumously, loving King after he died, telling stories about King after he died, we create a narrative of King as some kind of multicultural, liberal, political action figure. To deal with or address issues of race. About race, because Dr. King wouldn't want to start about race. Dr. King wouldn't want affirmative action. That's the one that made King so unpopular. It wasn't telling Negroes not to hit back. He was hella popular when he told Negroes not to fight back. But saying that we need a material investment in the beloved community, that's something else. So, what I want to talk to y'all about was how we get there. Through King's tradition, not my vision, not Justin's vision, but through King's tradition, because King's tradition has something to offer us, in particular, about the beloved community. I want to begin with the dream, but not the speech. We hear about the speech enough. Too much. But King's political work begins with a dream. King is standing on the Mall of DC, and he says he has a dream, and we focus on the multiculturalism of it. We focus on the multiracial, it looks like a Target commercial, right? That ain't what I'm talking about. King began by articulating to the world, with some help from Mahalia Jackson, by the way. You remember that? He'd given a speech, the sermon a little while before at a church, and a couple weeks later he started to talk and he started to preach and he started to give his speech and he was trying to find his footing, and then Mahalia Jackson, any good black woman does, got him right, told him what he needed to be doing, and she said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." At which point he began to articulate the most ambitious and profound freedom dream that perhaps we've ever heard. That's the dream I'm talking about. I'm saying that to build the beloved community at this juncture in history, given everything we're dealing with broken schools and poverty and war and all of this stuff, to get where we want to be, it has to begin with a dream. It has to begin with the radical imagination. We must begin as King did, by running toward that which is deemed impossible. Y'all with me? We have to begin with that which is deemed impossible. So much of our time, so much of our labor, so much of our professional and political work is spent being told what we can't do. We ain't got the budget for that. That'll never work. And if you work with elders, they go, we can't, we tried that 30 years ago and it didn't work. Or the opposite, we can't try that because we never tried it before. The radical imagination begins with something which seems impossible on its face. America was built on enslaved African labor. The country's economy was built on it. The cotton industry was built on it. The insurance industry was built on it. There was no reason to believe that slavery would end. There was no reason to believe that America had the capacity to enslave it. And yet it did. There was no reason to believe that women would have access to the vote. There was no reason to believe 25 years ago that we'd have marriage equality. But we do. We begin with something which is impossible, but we don't stop there. For King, that was linked to his Christian faith. He was a student of Howard Thurman, the great theologian and mystic, who talks about the radical imagination in a different way. For him, it was linked to Christian faith. For him, it was linked to the story of Jesus. Thurman said, never scale down or reduce your aspirations to the events or to the level of the events that are your immediate experience. Never scale down your dreams to the level of the events that comprise your immediate experience. In other words, you don't have to be prisoner of the event. For Thurman, that was linked to the story of the cross. The scandal of the cross. He was saying that just as the crucifixion didn't have the final word on life, because there was a resurrection after the crucifixion, we don't have to let an event be the final word of the events of our lives. He said, just as Jesus was not prisoner of the events of the cross, we don't have to be prisoner to the events of our lives. Now, in a secular context, or even just a non-Christian context, what that means is we don't have to be prisoner to the events of the moment. We don't have to be prisoner to a statistic or to a political regime or to a prediction or prognostication, to an economic arrangement or an economic mode of production. We don't have to be prisoner to any distinct thing. We can have a more ambitious freedom dream than the moment tells us we can. We must run toward the impossible until it becomes inevitable. That is what it means to have a radical imagination. That's what the freedom dream is supposed to be. So in this juncture in history, let's stretch our imagination, or as Maxine Green would say, let's release our imaginations. Let's not scale down our dream to the events that comprise this moment. Let's not reduce our political aspirations to a two-party system where both of them don't care about us. Let's imagine something else. Let's not reduce our vision of black economic empowerment to a liberal politician dropping some money in the hood. We don't have to just beg for quarters. We can imagine reparations. We can have a more ambitious freedom dream. We can have a more ambitious freedom dream than warmer and fuzzier prisons and cops that dance in the street with us. We can imagine abolition. We don't have to reduce our dream to a successful Me Too movement. We can imagine a world where misogyny and sexism and patriarchy and rape culture are eliminated so that everyone is treated with safety and dignity and humanity. We can have a more ambitious freedom dream. We don't have to dream of two-state solutions. We can dream of a free Palestine. We can have a more ambitious freedom dream. That's what King called for us. So let's, especially as we enter an election season, let's not just assume that we have to settle. Y'all all right? King's legacy is also a legacy of deep listening. King emerges out of a black radical tradition that is committed first to recognizing the value and the voice of all people. Black folk didn't want to get free so we could be oppressors. as great Idom Katachu talks about in her book, World Making After Empire, we didn't want to nation build, we wanted to world make. We didn't want to create new oppressors and new kings and new presidents and new formations of violence. We wanted to imagine new possibilities for what the world meant. But that meant that we had to recognize the value of all voices. When the Black National Anthem is created here in the United States, it's in the midst of an apartheid state. When it's written in 1899 and put to music in 1902, slave codes are turned into black codes. Black folks still couldn't sit at a lunch counter. Black folk were profoundly unfree in this country. But black folk didn't write a song as we could have that said, lift some voices. We didn't say, lift black voices. We said, lift every voice. That is a different kind of moral imagination that believes that everyone's voice matters. Sometimes, though, listening to different people's voices is challenging because it's a political matter. Sometimes it's a moral and ethical matter. I mean, we live in a world of deep transphobia, where we sometimes don't hear the voices of our transcends just because we can't. We dehumanize them. Sometimes we think if you don't have a passport or a citizenship card, that somehow you're less valuable within the boundaries of these false, fake nation-state borders, and we don't listen to the undocumented or the alien voice, as they're wrongly and derisively called by the right. We can't hear it. We live in a world where we often still don't hear women's voices. We go into election year every year, but especially every 4 years, and they're like used car salesmen about who's going to save the middle class, who's going to protect the rich, and we don't say nothing about poor people. Part of King's danger and radical identity was connected to the fact that he had a poor people's movement, because he knew that the voices of poor people mattered, but he also understood that the voices of poor people were often muted in the public sphere. King understood that we needed to not just be locked at the arms and we shall overcome, but also locked at the circumstances, a matter of political strategy. King wanted America to listen to the voices of the vulnerable. He watched what happened in 1960. John F. Kennedy walked through Harlem, holding up a black baby. It was dismissed as a campaign stunt, cheap political theater. He was just trying to make Adam Clayton Powell happy. Kind of like Bill Clinton playing saxophone in '92 on Arsenio Hall. Or Hillary in '08 going to a church in Selma, trying to clap on a beat. She almost got it. Cheap political theater. Juxtapose that to Bobby Kennedy walking through Appalachia. He's in West Virginia holding up a white baby whose belly is bloated. He's crying, snot is coming out of his nose. He's hungry. We begin our war on poverty. White misery is less tolerable in this country. We had to whiten the face of poverty to make it real. Understand, that's not King's moral vision. King's moral vision is one where a baby in Boston, and a baby in Berlin, and a baby in Birmingham, and a baby in Botswana are all worth the same, but he understood as a matter of political strategy that we could not hear, and we were not committed to listening to the voices of the most vulnerable in this country. He said we gotta change things. King was part of a tradition of forcing America to listen to itself. Forcing America to listen to itself. When King is standing in the Mall in Washington on August 28, 1963 for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, he was part of a deep tradition. He was standing on the shoulders of a long tradition of signifying, a long tradition of indirect speech, a long direction of using the spectacle to produce something else. What do I mean? It was August 28, 1963, 100 years after what? That's right, the Emancipation Proclamation. Somebody here got it. Engineering and science grad, that's right. So King, the march itself was an act of signifying. The Emancipation Proclamation was supposed to do what? Free the Negro. To emancipate us. So he, 100 years later, has a what? A march on Washington. And he always truncate the end part, as if they were just there to hang out. A march on Washington for jobs and freedom. King was saying, what does it mean to be free but unequal? What does it mean to have been emancipated in 1863 if I can't get a job in 1963? What does it mean for me no longer to be considered chattel in 1863? I'm no longer property in 1863, but I can't afford to buy any property in 1963. So King stood in front of who? Lincoln. Oh, he was going in. A great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand, signed an Emancipation Proclamation. He talked about the hallowed decree. He said, we come to the nation's capital to cash a check. He referred to these documents, the Constitution, etc., as promissory notes. Some of y'all can relate to this. He said, the Negro's check, however, has been returned insufficient funds. He said, the Negro stands on a vast island of poverty amidst an ocean of material wealth and prosperity. He said, I refuse to believe the great vaults of democracy could be empty. He said, nation better have my money. King was saying, America, listen to your own articulated promises of freedom. The way that we turn the table, the way that we fight back against that historical narrative of King that has emptied him out, or even reduced that speech, forget all the other ones we don't listen to, that has reduced that speech to a desire to make the world look like a Pharrell video. Instead, what we need to do is understand that what King was calling for was a fulfillment of broken promises. That is not a dream speech, that is a broken promises speech. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, America, you promised. Declaration of Independence, America, you promised. Constitution, America, you promised. Emancipation Proclamation, America, you promised. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, America, you promised. Or you tried to promise. 1954, you tried to fix that promise with Brown v. Board 1. You promised 1955, Brown v. Board 2. America, you promised 1964, public accommodations. America, you promised 1965, voting rights. America, you promised. The legacy of King is demanding that America keep track of and hold itself accountable for its own articulated promises so that one day perhaps we can live in a nation that is as good as its promise. But as King listened to those narratives and utterances of freedom, he became increasingly frustrated. Increasingly open to the possibility that America didn't have the capacity to fulfill this promise. That capitalism didn't have the capacity to create the beloved community. That a nation, a settler colonial nation state didn't have the capacity to produce democracy. That's the King y'all don't want to hear, but that's the inconvenient King. But it's the true King. King said before he died, I am apt to believe now that most white Americans are unconscious racists. That complicates the dream a little bit. King was a preacher, if nothing else. And In 68, he had a sermon in his pocket that he was going to preach that Sunday if he had lived. Why America may be going to hell. That's a hell of an analysis. Now, this wasn't just an eschatological argument. This wasn't about America as a kind of physical being that's going to go in some eternal Jehannam, some eternal hell. No, it wasn't that. He was making a sophisticated political analysis of where America was and what hell meant here. He was talking about the failure of America to be able to deliver on any kind of moral promise. He turned to Harry Belafonte and said, I fear that I have integrated my people into a burning building. What Mr. B told me before he passed, may he rest in peace, was, he said, and I looked back at Martin and I said, then we must be firemen. Some of us like, let it burn. Let it burn. Sometimes that's what you need for salvation. That's what the radical tradition is about. Not literal fire, but the radical tradition is about uprooting things, not fixing and tinkering around the edges, but to dismantle the whole system and build something different. First it's destroyed by water, and the next time is what? Fire. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. Y'all know the rest. But that wasn't King's vision. But King commanded us to listen. King's tradition was also about radical action, courageous action. Having a radical imagination is one thing. Having an analysis is another thing. But then taking that analysis and putting it to work is what we must do. King believed in radical action. King believed in organized action. I'm gonna leave y'all alone in a minute. I know y'all, it's after Saturday afternoon, y'all want to get going, but let me just break down this last piece for you. King is talking about courageous action. King's tradition was a nonviolent tradition. He was in a Gandhian nonviolent tradition. King believed in nonviolence not just as a tactic, but as an overall philosophy, as an overall strategy, as an overall way of navigating the world. And some people, and I hear young people say this sometimes, and I want to ironically slap them when they say it. They was cowards. They was scared. Nothing is more courageous than nonviolence. They wasn't hiding and being nonviolent. They wasn't in the closet of their homes being nonviolent. They wasn't on the couch being nonviolent. They were in the street. They were taking the bites from Bull Connor's dogs. They were getting sprayed with water hoses, and they had to organize and train and freedom riders to sit there and be disciplined and sit in a chair and get yelled at for practice and screamed at for practice and spit on for practice and have things thrown on for practice to see if they had the discipline and the fortitude to stand up and keep going despite the fact that violence is going to befall them. Do you know what kind of courage that takes? It also takes a certain kind of moral clarity to say that I will not allow your actions to change my fundamental constitution. That's something else. Nonviolence might not stop you from hating me, but it stops me from hating you. And I'm taking that ideology and I'm mobilizing it. I'm not just thinking that and feeling that from a space of safety. I am entering the fray. I'm sitting on the Pettus Bridge. I'm walking across the Pettus Bridge. I'm sitting in lunch counters where I'm going to get beaten. I'm walking on buses where I'm going to get bit. There's nothing more courageous than nonviolence. Now, I don't agree with them. King was wrong about some things. He pledged alpha. Be careful. Nobody perfect. But I happen to believe that nonviolence is a tactic, not as an overall philosophy. I don't think you can beat or defeat our open enemies without armed self-defense. And I think history bears that out. That said, King's tradition was one of organized action, local mass action. Local action connected with mass action. He said, when dogs bite us in Birmingham, we bleed everywhere. That means I have to have an analysis of what's happening there and understand the relationship between there and here. Courageous action, connected to an internationalist analysis. He understood what he referred to as the triplet of misery: racism, poverty, and militarism. He understood that those three things were interconnected, and I couldn't get rid of one without the other. I cannot end militarism as long as we have mass poverty, because if there's mass poverty, then there are hordes of wealth being collected by other folk. And those people who collect hordes of wealth control the wealth by controlling the people. And what better way to control people than through violence? We can't end war as long as there is money in war. We can't end war as long as there's defense companies. We can't end war as long as there are people who get paid trillions and billions of dollars to clean up after the war. We can't end the war. We can't end warring or militarism as long as there are poor people who are being sent from this country to go abroad to fight wars of aggression against other poor people, and then they return to this country and still don't have access to the basic spoils of democratic citizenship. That's what it means. That's the contradiction. That's what King was talking about when he talked about that relationship. So his analysis of the local and the domestic and the global was connected to the fact not just that he cared about stuff elsewhere, but that we couldn't escape elsewhere if we wanted to deal with what was right here. We had to connect the two. That was King's point. That was King's analysis. And so, King believed in organizing in communities, which is what we need to do. We got a new mayor that's immediately waged war on young people. He waged war on black and brown people. Even the light-skinned ones. The solution to crime is not more arrests. The solution to crime is building the beloved community. Jobs, education, mentoring, safe injection facilities. You can't arrest your way out of this problem. But it's a simple solution to a complex problem. King was saying courageous action. Courageous action. Courageous action meant we can't just take the simple answer, even when it's popular. King's commitment to organized action, courageous organized action. Again, I don't want to sell short how courageous this action was. It wasn't just courageous with the body, although it was. King was stabbed before he was shot. Black woman stabbed him at a book signing years before he was killed. He almost died. They told him that if he had just sneezed, he may have died. So King understood the risk and moved forward. And his organized action also meant being part of a what? An organization. At the current juncture in history, we often run from organizations. We run from collectives. We run from community. We run from building together. We live in the age of the selfie. Everybody is the star of their own show. Everybody has their own Instagram and Twitter page. Everybody goes live from the supermarket. We're so obsessed with ourselves that we can sometimes lose sight of what it means to build and struggle in community. Real local community, connected to mass action elsewhere, building and connecting with organizations elsewhere. But King understood that. And so the legacy of King commands us to join organizations, not any organization now. You want to make sure the organization represents your values and your ideals, but join the organization and stay in the organization. Too often we join organizations and leave because that selfie complex comes back. I didn't get the vote to be president. I go to black colleges, it'd be 50 black people, 25 organizations. Everybody president and vice president. At some point, we have to recognize that that's about us. That ain't about freedom. That ain't about liberation. We also have to reimagine the leadership model. The legacy of King, attached to the legacy of Malcolm X and the legacy of Marcus Garvey and others, would have you think that history is saved and delivered and advanced by a few charismatic men in front of a microphone. But the truth of history is that most people who struggle, most people who organize, most people who do the work never get their name written into the history books. They never get a byline in the newspaper. They never get a fancy business card. They never get a fancy title for their resume. But they continue to organize and build anyway. For every one king, there are 1,000 black women, 10,000 black women, 500,000 black women, millions of black women and men and queer folk and trans folk and disabled folk who never make it to the front because they couldn't be allowed to, but they still struggled. They still organized. They still built. They still bailed somebody out of jail. They still prayed for somebody. They still fed somebody. They still made photocopies. They still did the work. And so as we organize today, we have to move away from that singular model. I see the irony here. We have to move away from the singular model and reimagine community and leadership, which is what was so beautiful about Ferguson. It's not leaderless, it's leaderful. It ain't that there is no leader, it's just that there ain't one leader. And in a nation state that loves to kill our leaders, and forget that they wanted to kill our leaders. Every year I want to kick my computer screen in when I watch the FBI give a Happy Martin Luther King Day greeting from the J. Edgar Hoover Center, when J. Edgar Hoover was literally the one who committed his life to destroy black liberation struggles. His life to a government counterintelligence program, COINTEL program, and who specifically wrote Martin Luther King a letter saying, I'm going to shame you and embarrass you until you kill yourself. He literally tried to blackmail King into killing himself. So these organizations don't just sustain themselves easily. There are open enemies and not so open enemies, folk who look like us, your skin folk ain't your kinfolk, who infiltrate these organizations and undermine them. That's why it's important for principled people to stay in them. I don't want to be romantic about this. We've never all stayed in the same organization. You go to any black neighborhood in the world, you'll find Second Baptist Church. Third Baptist sometime. Somebody get the part in the choir, somebody agrees was nasty. Next, the Second Baptist. But we have an opportunity to do something a little different. To take the best of those traditions and also understand that our models are stronger when we have more diverse leadership. Not just in terms of raw numbers, but also who's leading. It can't always be men. Frankly, it shouldn't usually be men at this point. Nothing about history shows that when men run stuff, the world works out great, right? So there's plenty of evidence that we should reimagine and redesign our leadership models. That's part of what courageous action was for King, joining the organization, also forcing the organizations to be what they are articulated to be. It's not enough to be in the NAACP if you're going to be a neoliberal, wealth-chasing, taking pictures at the Trump Tower, talking down to Negroes NAACP. You need to be a 1909 Ida B. Wells Barnett, W.E.B. Du Bois lynch-stopping, freedom-chasing, Africa-affirming NAACP. Who are we going to be? That was King's tradition. King was coming out of the same tradition. King came out of a black church, but he said, I'm not going to be no Creflo Christian. Somewhat anachronistic because Creflo wasn't born yet. But he wasn't going to be no Daddy Grace or Father Divine, Reverend Ike Christian. He was coming out of a James Cone, Howard Thurman tradition, where he believed in a God of the oppressed. And he marshaled all of his spiritual resources, all of his faith, not to get people to believe in a hereafter, in the sweet, pie in the sky and the great by and by, but instead to believe in here after oppression, here after white supremacy, here after capitalism, here after militarism. That was the hereafter that King was fighting for, and then he marshaled his religious and spiritual traditions to produce. King was a radical revolutionary Christian. And that was the other part of his radical legacy. King was a courageous truth teller. Organizing the Montgomery bus boycott is a certain kind of courage. The March on Washington, a certain kind of courage. But perhaps the most courageous moment for King wasn't in 55, and it wasn't in 63, it was in 67, when he walks into Riverside Baptist Church. And he gave a sermon that he delivered once before, but never like this. His arms were shaking, he was nervous. The stakes were high. It's April 3rd, 1967. He said, why I oppose the war in Vietnam. This is the other part of the King that they don't want you to remember. Yes, he was the patron saint of nonviolence. Yes, he told Negroes not to fight back when they get hit with bricks and bit with Bull Connor's dogs. But he also walked into that church and into D.C. and anywhere else that would listen, and King stood up and said, the same spirit of nonviolence that compels me to engage the police and Bull Connor's dogs and all the white racist people who are beating on us with nonviolence, that same spirit commands me to tell us not to fight a war of aggression in Vietnam. The same Gandhian spirit of nonviolence to say it's wrong to fight violence with violence here and to turn the other cheek here tells me we got to do it there. And he linked that to a courageous political analysis that said, who is getting sent there? Poor people, black people, vulnerable people, to kill other poor, brown, vulnerable people, as Muhammad Ali said, who ain't never called me nigga. And then when I come back to the United States, I can't get a job. I can't live on the block. I can't eat at a restaurant with the very same people who I sat next to and killed those vulnerable brown Viet Cong. This is wrong. This is a courageous position. King wasn't partisan. Don't let them tell you he was some right-wing Republican. And don't let them tell you he was some head-scratching liberal Negro Democrat either. What he was someone who had a radical critique of American democracy, who had a revolutionary vision of what freedom and liberation could look like. And for him, that meant that we don't pick based on party. We pick based on principle. So in this moment in history, that means that we do not stand up and march against Donald Trump's policies and ignore Joe Biden's. We don't go to D.C. and critique Bush's war in Iraq and say nothing about Obama's drones in Yemen and Afghanistan and Iraq. If you're in Somalia getting droned, you don't care if that drone has a D for Democrat or R for Republican on it. The moral critique has to be the same. That's King's tradition. That was King's analysis. And that is what led to King's demise. I know we got to go, but listen, when King comes with that critique, it also created kind of radical solitude, an enforced solitude. King was abandoned. The tradition of King that they don't want you to remember is that King was left alone. King was left alone. 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was Time Magazine Man of the Year. Oh yeah, everybody loved him. By 1967, King didn't make People magazine's Most Admired Americans list. King got kicked out of his Baptist convention. The Negro preacher said King was too vain. King was a troublemaker. King just wanted the attention. King was all in the videos. They cast him out. King couldn't get a speech at an American university. American Program Bureau, his Speakers Bureau, couldn't book King because the universities wouldn't have him. Morehouse College, his alma mater, wouldn't put him on the board of trustees. They said he was a bad influence on young people. They said he went to jail too much. This is the actual legacy. It's not just King. W.E.B. Du Bois dies on August 27, 1963, the night before the March on Washington. Cast out of popular black company. Forced to live in Ghana. An afterthought to the March on Washington. They gave a note over the loudspeaker, the old man has died. Paul Robeson, abandoned, isolated. Isolation is what happens. Marcus Garvey, railroaded, lied upon. Alone. 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 When Malcolm X is killed in Audubon Ballroom, February 21st, 1965, the community that embraced him and loved him was getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The OAAU, the Organization of African American Unity, is small. Muslim House Incorporated, small. Maya Angelou would come back from the continent to be with him. A few others had come to be with him. His family was there. A few black comrades, one Japanese comrade who held him as he lay on the Audubon Ballroom in blood. Alone. When you speak against empire, you're going to be alone. You can't win the presidency speaking against empire. You can't empire your way into, or critique empire as a way of getting to the presidency. And if you get to the presidency, you can't then undermine the empire. That ain't how it works. You can't join the Klan, kick down from the inside. You can't speak out against the world powers and expect to have all the spoils of the world. Everybody want to go to heaven, don't nobody want to die. King shows you that at the moment that you speak up and you speak out, you're an enemy of the state. King opposed Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson told him to stay in the Negro's place. The doors to the White House were now closed to him. He understood. King understood the odds. That's why on April 3rd, 1968, when he gives that speech, he understood that he was in his last moments. Maybe not the last day, but he knew that he was dying. He knew that he wouldn't survive. But he also understood that there was something bigger, something broader, something brighter in his individual life, and that was the liberation of the people. that was the construction of the beloved community. And so the King's legacy reminds us that if you're doing this thing right, you probably ain't gonna be that popular. That if you're really striking a blow for freedom, you probably won't get all the trinkets and toys and awards and titles. That liberation has never been achieved by a majority vote. That it's always a small group of committed folk and courageous folk who are going to fight for freedom. And then once we start to get close to freedom, people will start to say, yeah, that's right. When you start to achieve victory, people say, I was with you the whole time. But that's okay. We love our people enough to forgive them in advance. But every single day we do the work. Every single day we dream more radical freedom dreams. Every single day we listen to the voices of the vulnerable. Every single day we engage in courageous action. And every single day we hold on to radical hope, not optimism. Not the belief that everything's going to be okay. Remember, King said, the world's all messed up. He said, but only when it is darkest can you see the stars. So in this moment of darkness, we hold on to the star. The star is you. The star is us. The star are those young people in the streets of Minnesota who turned that town upside down and put abolition on the minds and on the tongues of every single person in this country. That's a star. The star is during COVID when the government found a way to find all them checks and all that money and all them names to save American capitalism. That same spirit can now be used to demand reparations. That's a star. That's a star. The star is in the tragedy of an imperial war on Gaza. There are young people all around the world waking up, and grown folk all around the world waking up and seeing that all the talk we've had about two-state solutions, all the talk we've had about fixing the problem by tinkering is now impossible. And we can now struggle for a free Palestine, and a free Congo, and a free Haiti, and a free Sudan. That we have the capacity to organize and to build and to produce the world that is not yet. That is King's dream. It's not a bunch of black and white people at a table. It's producing the world that is not yet. King has left us, but we remain here. We are fully capable of doing that work, and I have never been more certain. I have never been more confident. I have never been more committed. Than I am at this moment. To the belief, to the fact, to the inevitability that we will be victorious in our struggle. I want to thank you all for spending some time with me. God bless you. We all beautiful privilege. We have time to take a few questions. And there's a microphone right there, so you can come on up and ask your question. Let me go from there. Take your time. I know it's awkward to have to like go.
First, I want to say thank you. Is this working? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
First, I want to say thank you so much for offering us your knowledge yet again. And I wanted to ask a question about, I think a lot of us know that there are a lot of people who are these liberal Democrats who do understand this concept of abolition and do understand that, like, we aren't going to get to the end, like, without doing that. Like, we can't work within the systems, like the KKK analogy of, like, you can't join the KKK and think that you're going to take them down from the inside. Like, that's not how it works.
Right.
But a lot of people don't have that courage, right? Like, a lot of people don't feel like they have that the community is strong enough and that they're united enough, or like that there's still tremendous amounts of like intra-community work that needs to be done, even with like solidarity of like all these different movements that you are talking about. Like what can we do as people who are in this community, who want to see those things happen, and offer courage to the people who are on the cusp of joining but like are too scared because they still want to vote for the lesser evil?
Yeah, it's a great question. Complicated question, but a great one. The first thing I'd say is we need political education. That's where it all begins. We have to give people permission. We have to give people permission to imagine new possibilities. That happens when people have more information. Part of what people need is to understand the interconnectedness of our respective struggles. So, because I'm speaking first to the intracommunal question of solidarity building and information building, right? Which also goes to getting people on board. If I say, well, I would really love to talk about abolition, but I'm really more focused on schools, right? Well, through political education, people can recognize, well, even if I'm not an abolitionist, even if I'm just a reformer, I just want to reform prison, those warmer and fuzzier cages I was talking about earlier. Well, recidivism is stopping people with access to books in libraries. But nowadays, I talk to Mumia with Jamal a few times a week, and I send him books all the time, stuff I want him to read. And I used to be able to send it to him. Now I got to send it through an intermediary. And for a while, they had a list of only like 100, 200 books I could choose from. You'll be shocked to know none of my books were on there. None of his books were on there. And we understand that school, as Monique Morris and others have talked about, pushes kids out. And the more likely you are to be pushed out of school, the more likely you are to be pushed into the criminal legal system. We understand how school discipline policy models itself after the kind of carceral practices that we see inside of prisons and jails. So, as we engage community, we can say, well, I feel you that you're not ready for abolition. You're worried about schools, but if you want to fix these schools, we can't have schools that are literally making money by being privatized and by being economically exploited, often through the very same people that have investments in private prisons. We can't fix schools as long as our school discipline net is wider and deeper, and we have school resource officers who just further militarize the school space and leave people in the prison. So we can't fix one without the other. We can't fix militarism without fixing poverty, right? Black people tell me all the time, well, I can't worry about the environment. I'm black, I'm worried about the police, I'm worried about a whole bunch of other black shit. I can't really worry about the environment. And I feel you, right? Like, until you look at where waste is dumped, until you look at food insecurity. If you don't think there's a relationship between racism and the environment, go to Flint, Michigan. Or go to Bentham Harbor, Massachusetts, or go to Baltimore, Maryland. Look at the parts per billion of lead in the water. That's literally killing us. And so these relationships, I think, get us there. People need to see a relationship between our political analysis and their immediate needs as well. It's another next phase of what I would tell you. The Black Panther Party for self-defense was so powerful, partly because they met people's needs. The Panthers' breakfast program was an extraordinary intervention into people's lives. Paulo Freire talked about it. He said, I couldn't study in school until when I was hungry. I couldn't struggle or organize, I was hungry. The Panthers fed people. Before they gave you their political line, you ate breakfast. The program was so powerful that the U.S. Department of Agriculture created the school lunch program, the free lunch program at schools after the Panthers, partly because it worked, but more importantly, to undermine the power of the Panthers. Point being, we have to begin with people's needs, and I think sometimes we come with sort of abstract political ideas and sort of distant political forms of political education that don't speak to people's conditions, their circumstances, or their needs. We need to do that, and then we need to show people how their needs are connected to their needs, and this person's needs are connected to that person's needs. And when we do that, I think people have permission to believe believe that the effort that it takes to organize and to resist is worth it. Because it's so much easier to just believe that we can just get that last Democrat in. Biden looks real progressive. He can't be better than Trump, sure. We'll win this time, we got it. Because that's all we have access to. So, anyway, that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Parker. My question really revolves around your conversation around two things. The reduction of nonviolence as a strategy, and also not romanticizing or over-glorifying armed struggle, especially as they relate to Dr. King. Because one of the things folks don't know is that, yes, he was a proponent and a practitioner of nonviolence strategy, but the King household had guns.
You did 38 though, right?
And again, not to glorify, but the King household was consistently in danger. And so I wonder, in your experience, how do you reconcile those conversations around the aspect of armed struggle in the King legacy and its current reduction and its consistent reduction and its erasure?
Dr. King never opposed armed self-defense. He wasn't going to let people come in his house and shoot him to death and not shoot back, right? For King, nonviolence again was a philosophy. It was a strategy. It was a moral claim. It was a moral assertion, as much as it was a political tactic. He also understood that the spectacle of violence could shift American sentiment. So some of it was tactical, right? He understood that. People turning on their television and watching Negroes get beaten on the Pettus Bridge might make you go, To draw a comparison, beginning in 2014, we began to see a lot more media coverage of what was happening in Gaza. During the last Gaza war, during the last Gaza war, you started to see dead bodies, and you started to see YMCAs get blown up, and schools blown up. In the Vietnam War, we saw bodies start to come back on TV in the 60s. It changes the sentiment. The spectacle of violence can be leveraged in lots of ways. And so for King, it was a moral position, but it was also a political strategy and tactic. That I don't think it's overstated to the extent that King would never have relented to a different strategy. But I do think that that doesn't mean that you're outside the tradition of King if you walked around with a gun to defend yourself. I'm not advocating that, or I'm not taking a position on that right now. I'm just saying, I don't think that as such is outside the legacy of King. Now, when it comes to armed struggle, it's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know, how do Native Americans defeat settler colonial invaders without weaponry, right? How do Palestinians resist in the West Bank, right? How do Southern Sudanese or sometimes nonviolence works not because there's a moral conversion of your enemy, but because they're just choosing the alternative. Because they don't want the armed struggle. In other words, does South Africa get free without the ANC having an armed struggle? We can romanticize the Mandela, we can romanticize the struggle and talk about nonviolence and peace and all that stuff, but ultimately, it's armed struggle, what they call terrorism, what the United States called terrorism in 2008, that led to the liberation of those people. I can't imagine oppressed people getting liberated through nonviolence. And I'm not sure that King would argue that they could too, either. The United States is a very unique and particular circumstance. And I would argue, I'm not speaking for King now, I mean, even then, much of the liberation that happened, juridically, legally happened, what, after Civil War? Armed struggle. You don't march your way, you can't march your way out of slavery, right? And I'm not romanticizing the Civil War either, I'm just saying that I can't divorce those two things. So I think there are limits to the Kingian vision for liberation. Let me say one more thing. The Kingian vision, you can still keep on. The Kingian vision, I don't even stand there. The Kingian vision also rests upon the belief that your enemy can be morally persuaded. What evidence do we have that Afrikaners can be morally persuaded? What evidence do we have? You know what I mean? Like, what's the evidence of it? There's no evidence that these people can be morally persuaded. These occupiers, these invaders, these colonists, these, you know, it doesn't work. It doesn't work anywhere. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this event and sharing all your wisdom and stuff. So I was curious about, I know Dr. King in his last speech, I think he was supporting the, I think it was like the Tennessee, like the sanitation workers. Yeah. And it seemed like he was like, linking labor to Black liberation. And I'm kind of curious, like in the kind of wave of like labor organizing that's been happening kind of in the past 5-10 years, like where is like, I don't know, do you see hope like in researching like a Black labor movement?
Oh,
or might that be?
that's a great question. My short answer is no.
Okay. Oh.
Let me, hope, yes. Do I see extraordinary signs of like, you know, no. And I think that's another part of the King legacy that gets erased. Again, we link King to nonviolence, we link King to peace, we link King to multiculturalism. But King was also engaged in a radical political economic analysis. You know, King's last birthday, January 15th of 68, that morning, talk about linking struggles, he met with, he got dressed, they had a cake for him, he had to sing happy birthday, he put on his windbreaker, went down to Ebenezer, not Dexter, but Ebenezer, and he met with Chicano activists. He was trying to figure out how they could expand and reimagine and stretch the boundaries of the civil rights struggle. He met with Negro preachers, the meeting took a while, and they talked about how to build in the gains of 64 and 65. He met with anti-Vietnam activists, figuring out how they could stop what was happening in Vietnam in 68. And he also met with sanitation workers from Chicago on that day in January, not in April. April was Tennessee, but in January, it was Chicago, and he met with them because one had just been mauled. And King saw that as an opportunity to expand the conversation about safe working conditions, living wages, and workers' rights. You link that to a poor people's campaign, and you undergird that with the philosophy of the beloved community, and you understand that King was saying, even if he's not anti-capitalist in the way that I would suggest he is, at the very least, he understood that unregulated capitalism was a nightmare. He also understood that the labor movement needed to be a priority, that access to jobs and dignity and living wages were key. Were absolutely, jobs with dignity and living wages were absolute key. It wasn't the traditional bourgeois, middle class, you know, pull your pants up, get some fancy degrees, and then you'll be okay. King talked about all jobs having dignity. But for him, that wasn't just a moral position to be the proudest street sweeper you can be, which he said, but also street sweepers should be employed with living wages. That had to be part of the equation as well. So for King, the labor movement, and certainly inspired by and connected to A. Philip Randolph, was something that he took very seriously. I think we've abandoned it. Not to mention how deeply racist the mainstream labor movement is in the United States. That's the other part, right? Is that the fight for workers' rights and living wages is often the fight for white workers' rights and white living wages. King recognized that. And so I think there's two issues here. One is that we have not spotlighted labor unions enough, and the one thing Joe Biden did that I like, and I really mean like no one thing, was him standing with unions and sort of, again, putting a kind of spotlight on union and strikes in particular. I think that that's an important piece of the equation, but so much more needs to be done. And so I think to revive King is to revive, the radical legacy of King is to revive the labor movement, for sure. I got time for maybe one more question or two more questions. I'll see how this one, stay in line, let me see how I can do it. You know what, I'll take everybody who's in line, but we just got to, maybe I'll take a couple at a time. After I take yours, I'll take two and two. And because I feel some synergy here, go ahead.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Kiara. I'm so sorry. I'm just so nervous a little bit.
Kiara.
Kiara Robinson. Actually, my family, I just want to say that I know that you are extremely prominent in the Philadelphia area, for your work. And I give you just the most upwards of kudos for what you do. Because my family is absolutely connected to Mamiya. I just wanted to say thank you so much for helping him. However, I know that it's been brought to your attention kind of recently about basically what is going on in regards to the CIA. So what I mean by that is basically, about the sexual abuse that encountered.
That you encountered?
Yes, that I had encountered.
No, I've never met you before.
So you don't know about the sexual abuse that encountered?
I'm going to ask you to take a step back, please.
Yeah, you are.
This woman's broken into the store and vandalized, but it's on this Kiara Robinson. Yeah, I've never met this woman before. You have the video, right?
Yeah.
I'm not gonna call the cops. I saw it coming, that's what I'm saying, get Jesse. Thank you. I just got to get up.
Get up.
Someone get my stuff.
Let's just walk out.